and massacre of many of the people over there, and the freedom of the prisoners and others is something that has affected every single Syrian family across that country and those who have moved abroad. So inshallah, without further ado, we'd love to dive straight into the questions. But first of all, Sheikh Ruzwan, how are you doing?
Alhamdulillah Rabbil Alameen. Jazakallah khair al-jaza for the introduction. And obviously, there's many aspects to answering how are you, because alhamdulillah, we're always in a state of glorification of God in all states. Alhamdulillah ala kulli hal. I mean, life does seem to be a roller coaster of emotions, given what's happening in the Middle East, in Gaza, in Palestine, and in Sham over the last over a decade and a half. Something that's affected a lot of people, yourself as well. You said the last time you were there was 2008. You're from there, and you can, the reason I invited you on was not just because you're from there, because I think you have insights and your family has insights. I know your family is from Damascus, Sham, as we say, Damascus itself. And so hopefully it's a conversation. It's not there. I'm not here to answer questions on the pretext that I have insights, but I think it's worth listening to as many voices as possible in these types of situations, different experiences, but also different insights that people have. And I firmly believe as ʿUlamāء, even though I don't claim to be an alim, people that are given the status of speaking based on religious insight, I think it's very important that Muslim scholars do broach topics thoughtfully, and they address the questions having pondered over the ramifications of the answers that they give, and that engagement with a discussion or a topic is something that their students then also take on board. Because one of the reasons we're doing this session is, I think, specifically for students of the iSyllabus courses and people that have studied with myself or Sheikh Amir, who've been asking us about the situation. It's important for them to get a view which allies and aligns with the type of students that we want them to be, and also ulama we want them to be, because there's lots of lessons, positive lessons in the whole experience of Sham over the last century or so. And I think those kind of questions, I feel that there's a lot of animosity, a lot of conflict just in the discussions and dialogues that we do have on issues like this. Gaza is the same, where people are shy to say or are coward into not saying what they believe is truth or a type of truth. And I think we should be mature enough to have those types of discussions. And I mean, I always, whenever, I don't know how well you know me, but if I ever have a conversation or a discussion with somebody on any topic, my mindset is always that my mind is open to any type of counterpoint to what I'm saying, and I'll accept it right there. But I also want people to engage with whatever is being said from my side, for example, and to be listening to it rather than trying to find views and opinions that, in a sense, support or kind of buttress up what you have as your prejudice. Yeah. So I think something like Sham, that's definitely the case. The whole issue with Sham, I found it very, very traumatizing. For the first 5 or 6 years of the conflict, I found it very difficult to go to sleep. You could probably see, like, my eyes were always kind of bloodshot, and it was something I never came to terms with until I actually deep dived into the issue from a religious perspective, and the whole discussions about jihad, all the issues about al-khuruj ala al-khalifa or ala al-umara, rising up and revolt against leaders. So I did a whole course on this in 2016. I went to Turkey for 2 weeks just to kind of clear my mind, and I came back and presented this full day course on revolution, revolt, and khilafah. And it allowed me to understand what I think is the amazing contribution Islam has to building civilizations. And the context that we're in is one where obviously there's been so much destruction. Over 500,000 people have lost their lives. and the lives that have been lost have not been lost in a kind of clinical, clean surgical way. It's the most unbelievable narratives of death, destruction, and torture. And sometimes we try and put that to the back of our minds, just to be able to live, to sleep, just to smile is very difficult. And something that I did cry for a long period of time when for some reason it wasn't a logical thing when I heard of the conquest of Sham, when the kind of rebel armies had entered into Sham. It wasn't an intellectual response from me. I put on the news, and it's illogical to kind of let the emotion, but it was something that was real. And hopefully we pray to Allah that Allah has protected the people of Asham, their faith and their dignity, and Allah continues, inshallah.
I mean, I think you've touched on a lot of things there that we want to expand upon. It's going to be a really interesting conversation, inshallah. But just to echo my sentiment, I think I woke up to just message after message of what's happening in Syria, and being Syrian is like this assumption that I'm going to be the fountain of knowledge of kind of everything going on. And I remember actually, I've actually, maybe to my kind of disgrace, but I tuned out of a lot of the conflict more recently, just because it's so emotionally traumatizing. And actually, just the idea that I remember speaking to my dad on Friday, saying, "What do you think is going to happen?" And then by Saturday evening, Sunday morning, Syria was liberated. It just happened so quickly. It just took a while to warm up to the idea of that things have completely changed. But yeah, I want to go into something that I think is probably the most pertinent question in this, which is something I think Syria and the conflict there shook quite deeply into the foundations of this question, because I want to ask the question of what is scholarship and what is a scholar. And the reason I start there is because a lot of Syrians, and I think those more broadly speaking around the world, really began to question that once they saw the role that scholars played in the conflict. And actually, they began to question, who is it that we take our knowledge from, and who is it that we take our spiritual leadership from? So I wanted to actually ask, so what are we defining here when we're saying, what is scholarship and who is a scholar?
Yeah, it's a very good question, because I think that was, beyond the physical trauma. I think there was an intellectual trauma as well. I think from a lot of the students of knowledge, a lot of the people that are my peers have studied in the Middle East, in Asham specifically, there was a lot of soul searching, not specifically about what scholars were saying. And I think it wasn't just about Syrian scholars, it was about scholars around the world. I mean, one of the things I'm not sure what I should do is name check scholars and actually refer to specific people, but I will, with the caveat that Abu Zur'a al-Razi, he said that, we mention people critically, and it may well be that they've placed, and he was talking about hadith scholars, they mentioned their frailties and their shortcomings, and he said it may well be that they've placed their bags in paradise 100 years ago. We, as Umar said, إنما نحكم بالظواهر. We judge people based on what we see and what they say, and even that is very important, because what you now purport to see and what you purport to hear about somebody is not usually what they are or what they've said or what they've done. So we live in a hyper information driven age, where you have edited clips and you have things out of context, and we know the Quran and Sunnah of the Prophet ﷺ is very much context driven. A verse out of its context in many places loses its force and its value, and the hadith more so, because the hadith are related to historical events that you can see, and if you don't see the whole things, many examples of companions quoting part of the hadith and other companions correcting them, and then it completely changes the complexion of what's happening. I think what people felt is that they'd sat, and amongst, at the very core of these scholars would be Sa'id Ramadan Boti, rahimahullah. I'll say rahimahullah because I said it before the revolution and revolt. I said it during, and I'll say it after as well. I don't think events, I don't believe that the Muslim Ummah is a community that rewrites its history based upon who's victorious. but we base it based upon the principles that led a person to live in a specific way. He's at the core of that, I think. And it really, you cannot address this question of what ዑለማء, what are the types of ulama we should be listening to until you understand something very simple, which is, imagine, trying to think of a good way of really making this hit home. Imagine you're driving, and then I'm telling you to while you're driving, to type a really important text, and that text is a really long text, and you're driving, and I'm telling you drive at 70 miles an hour, and the motorway is fairly busy, you're going to have a car crash. Now, scholars, society generally, Muslim society generally, this is very important to understand everything that I'll say. Muslim societies in general, since after the Industrial Revolution, from the onset of modernization and modernity, have been essentially trying to articulate their faith and respond to issues while trying to grapple with modernity itself. That includes scholars. So, one of the symptoms of that is the fall of the Khilafah. One of the symptoms of that is the whole discussion about reassessing or reforming Islam itself. Amongst that is the whole trends of the Egyptian Salafi movement, which tried to, bring in elements of positivism. And, Augustus Comte, very famous positivist from the French tradition, Muhammad Abdu and Rashid Ridha, we would imagine, were enamored by and kind of fascinated by his ideas. And so every scholar was trying to say, look, this is what the Ummah needs to do, and this is how we should do it. But everybody's got a different take on the reason why the Ummah is in the state it's in. But and then as a result of that, they would then say, okay, this is the solution, like a doctor saying, okay, this is the prognosis, this is the medicine you need. And so when we come to the Syrian conflict, we have got layer upon layer of that unraveling very quickly from the Second World War to the kind of pre-Ba'athist period up until 1963. And then during the Ba'athist period from 1963 to this year, you've got layers upon layers of this dissonance that is affecting the way that scholars are able to publicly articulate Islam. And we can talk about what the examples of that will be, inshallah.
But I think one of the things is, when has that not been the case? So there has always been a constant bombardment from the outside, and scholars having to deal with that as it's happening. And the only thing I can think that's different is maybe the pace of which these are coming at us, and perhaps you can say the governance with which they kind of are overseeing the infrastructure of where it takes place. But Greek philosophy, kind of the expansion of the Sahaba all the way into Persia and Rome, and having to grapple with being governors for the first time in such a large landmass. And you can kind of go throughout history and see kind of, there's always these modern new issues of having to drive the car and steer it. But isn't that what scholars are meant to be? Kind of, they're not just kind of logicians, but they're actually spiritual guides, people who are there to guide us and in the divine source of knowledge, and be able to take us where we're meant to be. Because that's maybe where people feel the confusion, because this is their subject of expertise, I suppose.
Yeah, so it's not their subject of expertise. Their expertise is, and I've spoken to so many students of knowledge and scholars on this, their expertise is in deciphering religious texts. The application of that is context driven, and also the complexity of the modern age is such that you have another layer of complexity, which is the depoliticized nature of the Islamic narrative now. In terms of the post-Khilafah period, what you essentially had is I would say the powerlessness of the old classical scholarly families. That in Damascus was the Ghazi family, it was the Hamzawis, it was the Kazbaris. All these were classical. Al-Attasi in Halab, for example, that family had the muftiship of Halab from, I think, the time of Sultan Mehmed II, all the way up until 1980 or something. So these were all disrupted. And remember, there's lots of people vying for the role of being the religious interpreter. So what happened during the fall of the Khilafah, everybody then asked this question of what went wrong. Why did the Muslims fall into the state they're in? And you had nation states, you had Arab nationalism, you had Jamal Abdel Nasser, you had the kind of the union of Syria and Egypt. You had lots of things happening, and scholars are constantly trying to make sense of what their role is. And while they're doing that, there's factions within scholarly circles. There's the Salafi movement, there is the modernist trends. In the Salafi movement, there's probably about 4 different trends. And amongst the traditional scholarly classes, there's a whole change of guard. If you think of Damascus or Syria, Greater Syria generally, the great scholarly families by the mid-60s had all but disappeared, apart from probably the Khatib family, had disappeared from engaging in public life as scholarly families, holding the fort. So if you think of people like Sayyid Ramadan Boti, he's the son of an immigrant, a great immigrant, Mullah Ramadan, rahimahullah. He essentially is foreign to the country itself. If you look at Kaftaro, who was the Grand Mufti of Syria up until I think it was 2004 when he passed away, again Kurdish origin. And if you look at all of the great scholarly families of the modern period from the 1960s, Hassan al-Habannaka rahimahullah, you've got Abdurrahman Habannaka, his son, even Salih Farfour. All of these people essentially were not raised within families that had religious power, but they had to try and make sense of it. And they had to try and make sense of it, if you think about it, without the power structures that would support them. Abdul Karim Rifa'i, for example, the head of the Zayd Jama'ah, they had to create their power structures while at the same time having to navigate an autocratic regime which was trained in the most brutal military tactics of interrogation and torture, which was then juxtaposed to across the border Iraq, Saddam Hussein with his own Ba'athist philosophy. And they were trying to make sense of how do we allow Islam to not only survive but thrive. So that was the question when in 1963 the Ba'athists come in. Scholars do not have the power. They don't. Even the population doesn't have the ability to fight or to represent a alternative civic platform. What their main focus? Imagine all these great scholarly families have disappeared, and then all of a sudden, Salih Farfour rahimahullah, essentially, I think his father was a confectionery, had a shop. Hassan Habannaka, his father, again, was a grocer or something. He had no political power, no physical power, no financial power. Sheikh Adib Kallas, one of my teachers, was a plasterer. All these families were new families. And within a tribal, culturally diverse country like Syria, you have nothing to fall back on for support, apart from saying, okay, we've learned the fara'id, we know the religion, and we're in no state to impose or insist upon certain things. Or how do we make our religion not only survive but thrive? And my argument would be that they managed to do that up until, I mean, I remember, I'll tell this, Talha, I left in 2005, 2006, and I remember 2005, it was I'm thinking it's the Eid al-Adha, and Bashar al-Assad is reading the Eid al-Adha, and obviously the imam that's going to lead the prayer is going to be important. The person that led the prayer was a student of Usama Rifa'i. Usama Rifa'i is now here in Turkey. May Allah give him shifa, Allah give him a good health. He's the head Grand Mufti of the Syrian opposition. He's leaving, I think, either this week or next week. I think he may have, because I remember last time we kind of contacted to see what was happening. He was ill, but his student was given the role of being the khatib for that. Now that is very important. It means that a congregation who were essentially the ikhwan, a type of Ikhwani movement, which has also had aspects of tasawwuf and ilm. They were given the prerogative to be able to give the khutbah to the president, and that was a degree to which they had managed to create a space for themselves. I think President Bashar as well, in 2004 or 5, he went to meet a lot of the people that his father had banished from the country as well. So if when I left, and when I was here and I saw the Arab Spring, and it was taking place in Tunisia, in Egypt, I thought never in Turkey, never in Syria, because the way that this religious scholarship had allowed religiosity to thrive in Syria was such that I felt it would never happen, because they had got entrenched and they had power, and Islam had izzah, as long as you kept out of certain things, and that was the dark cloud in the background. And
so, I want to bring it back a little bit, because the question really that I'm trying to get to, Sheikh, and I think this is I'm going to move away from Syria for a moment, because I think the West has a similar crisis where you have a scholarly figure who is someone who's respected outwardly because they teach Quran or they teach whatever, but then they commit very heinous moral acts. That's the core of what I really want to ask here, because, and when it comes to Syria, and I guess in a country level, are scholars merely just judges, in the sense that we treat our lawyers and judges in this country, but there's a separation between religious and moral authority and actually spiritual authority. Because many Syrians I know, and many people broader than that, and it's not just to Syria, it's in Egypt and in other regions, they talk about, there was a post recently I read where they say there's the traditional, there's the government Sufis or the government scholars, and they're the people that are interested in X, Y, Z, or like pompous and propping up people and so on. So I kind of want to wrap this section of the conversation up with just quite a direct question, which is is the scholarly class now been misdirected, where people are kind of judging by the outward and judging by kind of their rulings and their actions, or is it something that I think we need to kind of rebuild the judgment of people, in terms of we judge people's character and have a kind of a new criteria of what it is that makes a scholar and what it is that leads these people in that front as well?
Yeah, very good question. The whole, a scholar is a scholar based on their moral character. Abdul Karim Rifa'i, who set up the Jama'at al-Zayd, which was a kind of very famous in Damascus renaissance of knowledge, and always a kind of a thorn in the side of the government, in a sense, because they were able to get the most educated young people. Abdul Karim Rifa'i, none of his students said he was intelligent, striking thinker, anything like that. It was just his moral character. It was his akhlaq. And the second thing he did is that intellectual, what would we say, kind of sharpness that you'd imagine a political commentator to have, or anybody with insight into lots of different areas. He wasn't even an orator, to be honest, but he surrounded himself with people that could do that, young people. So young people were attracted to that. Now, the whole thing of, scholars for dollars, which is essentially what you're asking, and the fact that essentially ties into Sufi Islam, I think it's in the context of Damascus, or Syria, Greater Syria, I think it's very difficult to make that case, because of the genealogy of scholarship, of respected scholars in that country, where they came from, where we know they came from, and essentially their motivation for what they did. So say, for example, let's just say Sayyid Ramadan Boti, the target of most of this type of narrative. I know exactly where he lived. I know the types of clothes he wore. I know the bus that he took to Jamid Dimishq. I could see him if I know what time I needed to walk in Rukn ad-Din to see him. He never, and everybody understands this, he never benefited financially from whatever situation he was given. So whatever critique happens, and in fact, I'll tell you something. I chaired a talk in Glasgow by a very famous American scholar from Georgetown University, and I asked him to give a talk and a conversation around socially impactful scholarship. So I thought it'd be about the UK, it'd be about America, and how can scholars be impactful. He decided to do a case study on 2 scholars, contrasting them in the context of the Arab Spring. And he said, one, we should burn his books. We should essentially, treat him as essentially outside the fold of Islam if we could do that, which was a certain scholar in Egypt. And then he said, on the other hand, there's Sayyid Ramadan Boti, who essentially had no choice because he was trying to save face, save his family, save his institutions, and he had no choice. And he essentially gave a lecture for an hour and a half on this. And at the end, I said, Sayyid Ramadan Boti, from the 50s, he was within the circles of the Ikhwan. In 1959, Mustafa Sibai wrote a book on socialism in Islam, or Islamic socialism. And the ʿUlamāء of Damascus really criticized him. And Mustafa Sibai is one of the heads of the Ikhwan in Syria. And he essentially, from that time until prior to the Hama massacres, in fact, even to the mid-70s, he put down his case against the Ikhwan and also the modus operandi of rising up against rulers. So he was consistent. And I said to him, look, it was quite embarrassing because I had to say, look, he's actually written 2 books on the topic of why he supported the crackdown in Hama. No, whether that's right or wrong is a completely different thing. The point is, he was consistent. And remember, the uprising in Hama wasn't headed by the Ikhwan. It was actually headed by splinters from the Ikhwan, who the Ikhwan joined later on in the 1980s, mid-80s, mid-1980. And so Sayyid Ramadan Boti was consistent. But his point essentially was to allow Islam to thrive in a situation such as the geopolitical situation that Syria finds itself in. Essentially, we have to decide what's more important, to fight for rights and justice, or do we have to provide the preamble to that, which is safety and security for all people, keeping in mind Syria's, very much segmented society in terms of culture, in terms of language, in terms of ethnic origin, in terms of all these things. I mean, you'll know this better than I do. I used to walk through old Damascus, going through different parts of the old city where different communities live. And that's a mosaic that is very difficult to keep together. But the scholars of Asham did do that by essentially providing a way towards a kind of citizenship model of allegiance and belonging. And I think what people are angry about, I think, is history, is destiny, how things unraveled.
Yeah.
And I think that's where people, when I speak to people, because I do speak to people and I sit down with them and they're very angry about things generally. And after a couple of hours, they kind of just are quiet. Because, if you follow the events and how scholars of Damascus, I know very well, I think there's a very good paper written on this. If you go on Google, you'll find it. Almost day by day of the uprising in Damascus after the Dar'a instance, there was a very interesting narrative among scholars and discussion among scholars of how do we deal with this. Because once the genie's out of the bottle, you can't get it back in.
Yeah.
And I would not, absolutely not, even if you revise history 10 years down the line and if things change, I would not be able to say that the scholars in Asham, apart from ones that had official designation, that they did it for other than the pleasure of God.
Okay, and I
can say that with complete certainty.
Okay, and mashallah, look, it's something, just to give some context from my experiences of Syria, is these discussions weren't new. I remember going to Syria and people accusing scholars of that time of being government stooges and kind of supporters of the Hama massacre. For some context, I have an uncle who was taken at the door of a masjid for having a beard and praying, and he was disappeared for 3-4 years into a prison. And this was well before this conflict. So I think people don't quite appreciate the context of what the scholars were operating in. And I also know that many Western scholars, I've heard my own teacher, Sheikh Sajjad, mention how he got disappeared for 3 days into like a prison, and then had to kind of come out and so on. The question I want to move to, and I want to segue into this actually, is, is it 14 years later, 300,000 lives or more lost? Was the cost worth it? Was this freedom worth the value that these people paid? And if you were to go back all those days and years back and be a scholar of the Sham and standing there calling people, if they could start this or not, what would you advise?
I mean, I have immense respect, because I've sat and in the most personal capacity, sat with the scholars, and to paint them as being people that were driven by anything apart from what they saw as the pleasure of God, I think would be a major disservice. And I include within that Sayyid Ramadan Bhoti. Sayyid Ramadan Bhoti, I used to attend his classes, his classes in the Mahad, they were kind of academic classes. He had public classes. And one thing about him that I found very difficult to get my head around was he was very headstrong, very dismissive, very much enamored by his own opinion. But that was it. In other words, if you asked a question and he thought you were playing with him in terms of catching him out, he would strike you down like thunder. Do you understand? But I cannot say that frailty and that shortcoming as a person he had, maybe it's not a shortcoming, would then affect his sense of wanting not what's best for him or his family, but for every human being in the country. I sincerely believe that was his motivation at all points, and I believe that was the case with Osama Rifai, who's here in Istanbul. All my teachers are here as well. One of my teachers just left this last week, and he gave the most impassioned. He was leaving, so there was a kind of collection of people coming together to see him off for his travels back to Ashab. And he said, look, he left because he had no choice. And if he had the choice, he would never have allowed the events to unfold as they did. But the thing is, people cannot understand. Like, I'll give you an example. If you asked me two scholars when I was studying Damascus, who I would have thought would have raised arms against the government and been at the front line of giving khutbahs to bring the government down, because these were scholars when I was there who'd be taken in by the mukhabarat. They'd be stopped from giving khutbahs for a period of time, and they would come into the ma'had and say, well, which of you basically told the Secret Service about such and such? Midway through the conflict, I saw a picture of both of them in Damascus. And I was actually so confused, because these people would never, وَلَا يَخَافُ فِي اللَّهِ لَوْمَةَ لَائِمٍ, as the Quran says. They don't give a damn. As long as they know what is right, they would say and not care about anything at all. And they were both there. They were both in Sham. They had not risen up. And I was lost for an explanation until I thought, they must have thought that it was not worth it. They must have thought that it was not something that could be justified to God on the Day of Judgment. And this is the thing about the world, is that, a lot of our movements, Islamic movements, they come to the party quite late, unfortunately. Egypt, the Ikhwan turned up late. It wasn't something that was instigated by the Ikhwan or the Muslim Brotherhood or the Islamists. In Syria, it was the same thing. All the Ikhwan had left Syria and they had moved on, and they'd put Syria, essentially, when I speak to a lot of people that left in the 80s, they put Syria into the back of their mind. And again, they arrived late. The people that stayed and put in the hours. And I remember I'm talking about scholars that I've seen put in the hours, living in single rooms with a kitchen and a bathroom and a room for their wife and them, who are teaching. And then they're the same people accused of being stooges for the government. I don't buy that at all. And that's why
can I ask something?
that sounds to be very unpopular, but I don't buy it.
So you keep, I'm going to just ask a direct question, because I want to just clarify this for the listeners, because then numerous times your justification for why you don't buy their reasoning is essentially because of the very zuhud that they lived. They're very they weren't interested in the world. They lived a very basic, simple life, and that's almost used as a justification. I've met the same scholars you meet, and I have nothing but the utmost respect for them. But I'm just asking this question because it's a question people will ask. Is that really enough of an evidence to prove that they wouldn't have taken opinions or roles that would have been different? And I can understand that they wouldn't want to take the money of the government. That's fine. But that doesn't necessarily compute that or equate that they would have made an incorrect decision.
Absolutely not. Absolutely not. But what is intonated is, well, their intention or their motivation for their position was essentially, what can it be? You have to then say, well, is it prestige? Is it power? Is it mansab? Is it to become the next Mufti Asham, for example? You can make a list of what it would be.
But let's leave the intentions question aside, because I think the intentions.
No. What I'm saying is motive, not intention. Sorry, motive. Like, what will be the motive? Apart
I don't
from
think it's necessarily motive. I think maybe it's a question of were they right? Can we just answer it in a very calculated manner rather than delving into?
This is my point. This is my point. My point is they calculated that the thriving and surviving of Islam for the community of Greater Sham was best served in the general consensus of the scholarly class that remained in Sham after a lot of people had left after the Hama massacres. That's it. So there's no motivation there apart from that one thing. And the thing about scholarly circles in Damascus you have to understand is that there's a very closely knit consensus among scholars in terms of personal contact, discussions. How do we deal with this? I remember twice Mahad al-Fath, Sheikh Abdul Fattah Abizam, I was translating for him, and in the midst of it was 2004, and the government putting so much pressure on him to expel foreign students, but then also change the curriculum. And I was watching him, and he was saying, he's as much as you can, to a foreign student. It was clear that he was thinking these students have come from like 52 countries, and he wants them to complete their education, and the government is just pressing down on them to take out all the classical texts and just put in all these different syllabi. And he was obviously thinking about what? Was he thinking about the fact that he wants to be the next Mufti of Asham? So you can only see that when you look in somebody's eyes, the concern. I mean, I don't know how else to explain this issue of motivation. It's not an intention, Talha, it's motivation. Because you have to convince me that the motivation of the collective of scholars, whose motivation, I believe, was the preservation and promotion of Islam in a very hostile environment, you have to provide me with evidence that that wasn't the case. And the unfolding of the Syrian conflict is such that, in 2013, I finished a book. Look, I was teaching a group of students in Glasgow. Got to the end, got to the last page. I read that I'd finished this in 2003, 10 years prior to it, on the same month. The signature was of my teacher, Al-Din Atiyah, who was killed. His father was decapitated. He was placed in front of his son's house so that he would come out. He was fighting the regime. He had no choice but to fight the regime at that point. Now, he was right. Sheikh Riyad al-Khiraqi, I gave that class on Khilafah, and I showed them a video of him on his deathbed because he wanted to be shown, and he had been killed the third attempt on his life by ISIS. They put a car bomb under his car. He was injured and he died in hospital. He had no choice but to fight. At a certain point, the Syrian conflict became one where it wasn't a choice between thriving and surviving. It was about survival. It was about protecting against rape, against torture, against mutilation, against mass murder and annihilation. At a certain point, the whole narrative ran away. And it's at that point that you kind of really do want the wise voice to be heard. And the people that are judging now, I think they would have very difficult time making sense of that situation. It's very easy to look at scholars and say, well, the standing of scholars was lowered by the whole experience of Syria or of Egypt or whatever. And I hear this, I go and meet young Syrian people all the time who have a crisis of faith. And part of that crisis of faith is, why does God allow this to happen? But part of it is, why do our scholars not stand up? And I think the reason for that is the narrative that they've been given is not clear, and it's not fair. And I think that's what we have to, that kind of vacuum of scholarly voices in the 60s and 70s being replaced by new scholarly circles. They still had a consensus, and that consensus was sometimes fragile, and a lot of them were expelled and they came back. But it's one of these things. I think what it points towards is the fact that there's a lot to learn. And we pray to Allah that Allah allows us to have that understanding that what the reason we're commenting on it is that we prepare ourselves for the next time. Because whatever's happened now and whatever we plan for the future is based upon diagnosing the problem properly, essentially, and that's really, really important.
So I think, mashallah, this is going to be, for those who don't know, this is going to be a two-part series, actually, because there's so many questions. I think we've barely got past the historical context to really dive into. And thank you for being quite candid with your answers and not being afraid to kind of answer a question. I know that this case study, or rather this conflict is going to be used as a case study going forwards in terms of regime change and what that might mean. And we will cover, I think, what a lot of listeners have asked is what comes next. So we're going to do that in another podcast series. But really what I want to look back is this a case study for how political change takes place? Is there another way in which many of the other despots and places, and Syria is not alone. Bangladesh has recently had a similar kind of riots and toppling of its leader, and other countries are suffering similar fates. What would you say is kind of, how would this be seen by the history makers in the future, and how this has been assessed of whether, and specifically the scholarly class writing the future book on hikam and on the rules and hukum and so on, how would they see this as a means for political change?
Look, there's lots of studies, a lot of commentators have looked into the Syrian scenarios, and in terms of religious scholarship, there is some interesting studies on this. Lisa Wedin, she wrote a book, and essentially, it's called The Ambiguities of Domination. She looks at scholars and how she views it, essentially as essentially how you presented it, which is the Ba'athist regime appropriated scholarship to legitimize itself. I don't think that makes any sense if you, again, look at the motivations and the Islamic principles that push scholars into making the decisions over the last 40 years that they made. I think a much better case is by Thomas Pire, who's actually in Edinburgh University. I met him a couple of times, spoke to him at length on this topic. He's got a book called Religion and State in Syria. And essentially, if you read that, you'll understand what I'm saying. Because basically, he said that scholars try to navigate through a very difficult situation with pragmatism to allow Islam to thrive and survive. It was pragmatic accommodation. And so that was the best option that you had. Because the reason why it was the best option is because every other option had been tried. You had, I think it was Hassan al-Haddad or somebody, one of the first people that instigated the Hama conflict. He was an offshoot from the Ikhwan, very much in the kind of mirroring Abdus Salam Faraj in Egypt, jihadist, calling for takfir and hijrah. All these things have been tried and they failed, and scholars essentially then regrouped and said, look, we need to educate and create a religiously literate community. And so it's definitely not a case study in how to, create change, because what we're left with now is at least 6 ethnic groups with different land masses. You've got, we'll talk about the next week, Israel extending its grip on the Golan Heights and further beyond that as well. It's just, one of the things I always think about when I'm answering questions is I think there's kind of layers of discussion. And at this moment in time, you're looking at the scholar and why he did it is dismissing like 4 layers that are dictating to a scholar the options that he has or she has. There's geopolitical issues, there's the military economic complex, which is above that. There's the kind of multinational international organizations like IMF, World Bank, and UN. Then there's the kind of geopolitical proxy wars that take place, and right at the bottom, with almost no room to wriggle, is a scholar. When you throw somebody into the water and you chain them up and they have to like untie, and then it's almost as if you're looking at the scholar saying you're essentially critiquing the scholar for what's going on above the sea.
Yeah, I think there's a few listeners who are asking some interesting questions, which we're probably going to cover in next week's talk, which is about some of the future foreboding of what's going to come, particularly with Israel, but even some prophecies around Nu'aym and Hammad. So I just wanted to let them know that that's something that we're going to save that part of the conversation, a very meaty part, to next week. So do tune in for that. But Sheikh, I want to give some color, because I think a lot of myself and you, we're familiar with maybe the context of Syria. But I want to give some color and flavor to those who are listening who maybe haven't heard so much about kind of what happened previously, and how Asad and both the father and the son kind of had a grip on scholarship and what that meant as a student. So maybe you can just shed some light onto that, because we kind of skipped that part of the conversation. And I think it'd be nice for people just to understand the context with which we're working within pre-revolution that led up to a lot of these things.
Yeah, so I mean, I remember, I'll give you one example. A student, I was in 5th year. No, I was in 6th year actually, my last year, and I was sat at the front of the class. And by that time, you've 6 years with the same students. The same class is moving, it started with like 190 students, and every year got culled down by people's failing, dropping out. And we were left with like 80 people. And then all of a sudden, this new student comes in, and he sits right next to me. He's kind of gingery hair, looks a bit Scottish. And I didn't know what age I couldn't make out his age. And he sat there. And then the teacher came in, and he looked at him, and the student looked at the teacher, and he said, Khalid, Wenak, and he started this conversation. And essentially, I found out that they were both classmates in the Mahad 7 years ago, or 8 years ago or something. And Khalid, who was now sitting next to me in the first day of 6th year, had been taken away by the Secret Service because he had a couple of books, and there was a couple of tip-offs of him on some kind of strange trumped-up thing, or his uncle, and he was put in solitary confinement. And he described the situation, which was there was no door. There was no door. There was a hole through which he was given food for 3 years. There was no light. And if you were to ask me, have you ever seen The Living Dead? I would say that man was that person. I got to know him quite well. I went to his house, saw his child, and he was because I was from the West, he was intrigued because by the time he got out of prison, 2 years he just devoured knowledge. He just read about history and politics and journalism. He wanted to be a journalist. And what he described to me, you cannot, people now have an idea with social media and the kind of images that we see, Abu Ghraib and these kind of things. I mean, I don't think people understand the sophistication with which you can torture people. And this is essentially where scholars were operating.
Yeah.
And in that kind of situation, what are you going to say to the people, your daughters and mothers and young men just struggling to get by in terms of just food? What are you going to ask them to do apart from survive and thrive and learn and hope to create a better future? And so the contrast, I cannot picture people not knowing what that contrast is. It is the worst. Imagine the worst scenario you can imagine. It's worse than that. And put yourself in that situation. It's worse than that, because it wasn't even trumped up charges. It wasn't the fact that they had to have a suspicion. The whole point was they would take people without suspicion. That was the point.
Exactly.
Yeah. And if you think about it, Saddam Hussein, 1979, Qa'at al-Khuld, it was the same things happening across the border, but they're not as bad as the Syrians. I mean, it's well known that the Syrian Secret Service and their methods of torture, incarceration, Tadmur, for example, is infamous for that. Even in Damascus, there's a couple of prisons that we knew of. And a lot of our scholars, a lot of the teachers, the two I mentioned, they were always, if they missed a class, we were always worried, especially if it was on Monday, because they must have given a khutbah and they must have been picked up. And, and I know, like, I've just mentioned 2 examples of teachers who were massacred. There's too many. I mean, there's people who studied with me who lost their memory. Do you understand? So they kind of were taken in, tortured to the point that they don't know who they are. And so, I think people, even the Syrian diaspora outside, maybe have been disconnected with the brutality of that. And I remember a lot of our students in our classes were nephews of uncles who had been taken in during the Hama massacre and the fallout to the Hama massacre. And they were young, but they had a kind of memory of this through their family. And so, I think you have to have confidence. And I want to let people who look up to Syria and the scholarship of Syria understand that apart from very few scholars that I know specifically just sold their soul to the devil, just because of the nature of that, of how scholarship works. All those great scholarly families, the whole Nahda, the whole kind of revolution of Hassan al-Habannaka, one of whose students was Sa'id Ramadan Boti, one of whose students was Abdul Rifa'i. All of that came from one or two people, which was Badruddin Hassani and Ali Dakar, rahimahumullah. Both of them essentially created a small group of students who then basically, they were so tightly knit that none of them internally broke from that impetus to do what was best for the ummah. And that was the motor. I mean, if there's anything you ask me to say, am I certain about in life, anything, ask me about anything, I would say that group of that scholarship, that outpouring of scholarship was there. And you could say they made a mistake in ijtihad. You can absolutely say that. You can say they misunderstood, they miscalculated. You can absolutely say that. But that miscalculation was one where, someone's like cutting a switch for a bomb and it's ticking away and you don't know which one to cut. So may Allah not put us in a situation, myself included, make dua all the time, that you're in a situation where you have to make those judgment calls.
Yeah. Because I don't think there is a simple answer to these questions, and I don't think there is an easy one, regardless of what you choose, it's always going to be someone losing. I mean, some of the personal stories that I've had in my family is, someone's brother is wanted and he escapes. So they take the whole relatives and family as prisoners until that person returns. And they can spend 16, 17 years in prison until that one individual who has left returns to the country. And that if you do return, they're not going to free the rest of them out as well. And I knew that in numerous families. Myself, I once went to a trip to Cyprus, and being an enthusiastic Westerner who doesn't think too much about talking about religion, I went to the masjid and took people with me. And the very next day, my dad called me and said, "What are you doing in Cyprus?" Because the Syrian Secret Service are knocking on all the doors. They found your uncle and they're asking, "Who's this Talha and what's he doing in Cyprus?" This was pre-conflict as well. And considering I have no Syrian registry or citizenship, it's just a British passport I carry. For them to have found out exactly who I was and where I lived and my relatives in such a short space of time just shows how far the tentacles spread. But I think, what do you think are the consequences of the impact that Assad government had over the last 50 years or more? And how is it now going to be reshaped with this newfound freedom? So what do you think is going to emerge from the phoenix of this war that will change kind of the course of the discussion and the conversation given all that's happened?
So I think that's what we're going to kind of delve into next week, because I think to address the kind of future questions and the trajectory of scholarship and scholars and institutions, and the possibility of scholarship in Asham going forward, I think we do need to understand the heritage that it has and appreciate it and understand the context within which they were operating. And I think Thomas Pearley, if you get hold of his book Religion and State in Syria, it is fascinating, because I think when I spoke to him, he spent 2 years in Damascus interviewing people that go to the madrasas, the mosques, the kind of students, engineers that go and do hifd of Quran, and their connection with the scholars, and they also interview scholars as well. And he basically put together this picture of not only the 2 years that he was there and interviews and understanding what makes scholarship tick, he also put it in the context of the fall of the Ottoman Empire, and then the changing of the guard of the classical families, who were essentially, a lot of them moved into business, into academic kind of pursuits, into medicine, engineering, where the money is, and also the prestige is, which is another question in terms of Islam and the degree of honor that scholarship is given. He pictured that amazingly and concisely, because once you understand that, you can then start to answer that question of, okay, how do we recreate, or how do we build upon, or how do we, depending on what you think, demolish and rebuild some kind of semblance of Islamic thinking and education and akhlaq, building institutions. I think the narrative I get now is that people want to start again. The narrative I get generally is, it was almost like Wizard of Oz, the witch is dead, or it's that, kind of almost immediate impetus to say, okay, we can now build that new thing. But my point is, when I started our discussion, I talked about the fact that all these issues come back to our analysis of what went wrong and why Muslims are in the state they're in. Essentially, the Ikhwan, or even traditional Islam, even the Salafi movement, even the modernist movement, they've all tried to answer that question. And from my perspective, they've all got it wrong, because all the kind of alternatives that have been presented over the last 100 years have not worked. And the reason they've not worked is that they've been so Muslim-centered that they've ignored the fact that the West had an engine of reasons, a specific set of reasons which allowed them to advance and become powerful, which are not related to religion at all. It's just related to the onset of modernism. It's related to, financial contracts that they innovated. It's based upon the Industrial Revolution. It's based upon freedom of speech and freedom of thought. There's all these other things we've ignored. And I think we have to then incorporate that into our analysis, because otherwise we're going to go back into the same situation where some people are going to want to fight a holy war, some people are going to want to revive and reform Islam and change Islam or whatever. There's going to be the same repetition. And I think unless we understand where we came from in terms of scholarship, where they went wrong, in fact, if they went wrong, my whole point would be, I don't think they did, but they did. I mean, let's just be fair to people that are critiquing scholarship, is they didn't provide an alternative. But again, if you lived in Sham during that period of the last, it's almost 50, 60, was it 60, 40, 60 years, what would the alternative be? What would you do? And that's the thing. I think people need to hold their tongues, and people need to engage their minds. It's very important that people engage their minds so that it doesn't happen again. And whatever you build is built upon strong foundations of analysis and appreciation of what has been given in the past.
Yeah, I think there's I'm itching to get into some of the future things, but we'll save those for some of the future, or for the next podcast, inshallah, because there's so much to explore there in terms of economics and political power and just even social structures. But kind of sticking on the topic of where we are in terms of kind of venturing a little bit into the future, but I want to look at it more from the past side of things, which is many quoted the hadith of the Prophet ﷺ, what's attributed to him, that a conflict will begin with the playing of children and would end with the emergence of the Mahdi. How much do you think this is relating to that? And how much of this is kind of foreboding something that's to come? I suppose we can deal with that bit next week, but really looking back at this, is this still something that you would attribute to those incidents?
So that's a good point. I mean, I think we'll wrap it up with that, because it's a segue into future, because the future is going to be shaped by our perception of what the future holds. And in our narrative eschatology, in terms of Akhir al-Zaman, it's become famous now, signs of the end of time, we essentially expect certain things to take place. And I'll remind you of the narration of Imam Ahmad radiallahu anhu. He said that, ثلاثة لا أصل لها. And this is exaggeration. He said 3 things have no basis. One of which is the narrations of Tafsir al-Quran, بالروايات. In other words, ma'thur, because a lot of it was fabricated towards opinions. And he said al-Maghazi, which is the kind of stories of the Sirah, the details of it. He said there's no isnad, but malahim as well, which is the signs of the end of time. There is a tendency to take, specific narrations and try and shoehorn them into the current situation that we have. And that's what's called, in sociology, they're called the Pygmalion effect, where you actually precipitate something because you expect it happens. Like if I say to you, Talha, we're going to get into a fight, and then I come in and I visit you and I slap you, and then we get into a fight. We go into a fight. I prophesized it, but essentially I precipitated it. It's what ISIS did when they took over Dabiq. Dabiq's in northern Syria. ʿUlamāqq, Dabiq. It's prophesized in Sahih Muslim that the armies of the Rome will come and descend upon the Muslims, and the narration is very famous. So what did they do? They arrived in Dabiq, ISIS took over, and they waited for the American and coalition forces to come and evict them. They came, they evicted them. Obviously you go there, slaughtering, and they basically burnt people. Remember, this is where they burnt the Jordanian pilot as well. Well, if you're going to do that kind of thing, it's going to happen. And I think we're in a dangerous territory where we're putting everything, our minds to the side. We're not analyzing. And so when we talk about scholars, it's simpler to dismiss. It's much easier to dismiss as a bad dream that this happened. And a very easy way to do it is just to say, well, scholars didn't give us the advice. Sorry, you've missed the analysis completely, because there was levels of coercion and geopolitical and strategic and multinational weights upon them that they could not essentially operate under. And if you then add in this narrative of the end of times, you're doing exactly the same thing, because what you're doing is you're clouding your judgment on what is required now. And how do we know what's required now? It's from very clear teachings of the Prophet ﷺ. And that's what we're kind of going to encroach upon next week, because the way of the shafi, of bringing calm to a situation and bringing peace and stability to a situation is in the prophetic sunnah. And that's why the prophetic sunnah and the seerah of the Prophet is such a complete story. Any part of your life, I mean, think of it, having your uncle's innards chewed in front of you, only to have to face the woman that did it later on while she's mocking you by asking you domestic issues about child maintenance, and being able to smile in that situation, you know, is as close as you get to the kind of postmodern industrial torture methods that were used during the Asad regime, you know, and the Prophet dealt with it, and it's recorded how he dealt with it. And I think there's this sense that people just clock off in terms of thinking, and they go into this realm of the unseen, or they go into the realm of looking for a Mahdi, or they go into the realm of the end of time, and you know, scholarship is dead and everything is thrown out. I think you have to be very careful, and scholars, specifically in this day and age, especially in the West, they have to, you know, make sure that they don't just fall into what people want to hear them say. And I think, but personally myself, I never do that, but it's just so tempting. Well, what do you want to hear? Okay, you know, let's do the chant on whatever you want to hear, whatever the followers or your students want to hear. That's not the way you do it.
Yeah.
You know, you want to go to your grave saying what you believe was right, with God as your witness, and that's it. And if people don't like it, that's fine. But sometimes you have to think, and thinking is difficult, you know, and applying it is more difficult.
No, mashallah, barakallah feekum. Then we covered a range of different topics there, and I still had more questions, inshallah, but we'll kind of look to next week to begin to discuss some of the topics really on the future of where things will go. And I think that's going to be a particularly interesting topic, because inshallah, it's probably the first time many people have had hope in that region in terms of what could come, and it would be nice to see your thoughts and hear what you'd like to say on that, inshallah.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, that's the ask. I think we want to set up to the future, and I think it was very important to just put those points that I presented now out to kind of listeners, so that they make sense of the kind of there's an over emphasis on the kind of knee-jerk reactions to people's death and the fall of revolution, the fall of dictators, and the euphoria that comes with that. I mean, at the end of the day, people still wake up with essentially very, very difficult situations to deal with. And, you know, you'd want people to go away having not just learned something, but then it's a life lesson for them, maybe in their private capacity, or maybe in helping the people of Asham, who we have an immense burden and of debt towards. And so the whole point is practical effects of listening. I mean, this is the whole purpose of doing these kind of things, is to have practical effects and benefit. Because one of my teachers in Asham did say, you know, Islam is essentially nashr al-khayr lil-ghayr, spreading good to other people. It's like this constant movement of giving goodness to other people, even in the most dark of situations, inshallah. So Jazakallah khair for hosting this evening. Inshallah, next week we'll be back at the same time on the same platforms, inshallah.
Inshallah. Jazakallah khair. Assalamu alaikum to all our listeners, and hopefully we'll see you next week. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.
Wa alaikum salam wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.